Great pleasure to have on the line with me, Dujon Pereira. He's a filmmaker, producer of Black Hole. It's a feature-length documentary film about the Whitehaven Coal's Maules Creek mine, featuring people like Jonathan Moylan and other activists. We've had a number of these people on the show, so some of our listeners will be familiar with this story. Thanks very much for joining us, Dujon.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess to start off with, tell us about how you got engaged with this project.
Well, basically a friend, a housemate, moved into where I was living and about March last year, and had been up at the Leard blockade and had seen some of the work that I've done, and had mentioned it to me. I never knew anything about the Leard State Forest or what was happening up there, and he encouraged me to go up and have a look, and I went up there to make a short documentary, and the next thing I knew I was making a feature length.
It's being very well received. I haven't got around to seeing it yet, and we'll have some details a little bit later for our listeners so that they can catch a viewing that's coming up soon in Fremantle. But being lauded as one of the most significant environmental films in 34 years. Now, I understand a focus for you in making the film was to make it more humanistic, obviously to really tell the story of these people that are participating in this, incredible act of defiance. What's one of those characters that sticks out? One of those particular stories that sticks out in your mind?
Look, I think that, as you're very right in the idea that I had when I went into making this film was, I think that the Maules Creek mine and the Leard blockade was just really, really interesting scenario because it brought together so many different alliances, which sort of unheard of in this country, between farmers and Indigenous Gomeroi, and also just everyday people that were wanting to sort of stand up and take action. And I think that there was a number of significant human stories involved in the scenario, and it's why I worked really hard to be able to tell all those stories across the board. I think that it was it's really hard to pick. I think that the Indigenous scenario was really interesting in it, because within for your listeners, the Leard State Forest is the last of intact species of white box woodland in the country, and within that forest, it's about 5,000 hectares of white box woodland, and there's a number of Indigenous sites, sacred sites in there. Yep. So it was particularly heartbreaking to see the Gomeroi fighting to save that, but also, unfortunately, the split within the community of how mining companies divide and conquer within that scenario.
Talk to us a bit about the mining companies. I understand that you're obviously trying to do a balanced job as a filmmaker. You did try to get the other side of the fence and some of their perspective. What was going on there, and I guess what was your success there?
Well, yeah, look, I tried, it wasn't tokenistic. I tried really hard to get Whitehaven Coal's perspective on it, and I approached them a number of times. They were concerned, as anyone would understand, that they would be taken out of context, and I tried to alleviate that as much as possible. I think that scenario, but they just weren't willing to talk. Like Whitehaven Coal and the Maules Creek mine is at the time the most controversial, and still the most controversial, coal mine in production, taking away from Chenoir and Adani. I think that they just felt that they just didn't want to say that, tell the story, their side of the story. I was approaching from that point that they were saying that environmental groups were skewing the facts, and I really wanted to understand how they were skewing the facts, or how they were perceived to be skewing the facts. And it was, they just, weren't willing to talk. And, I went to great lengths also to speak to the local community that were for the mine, and also for workers that were working within the mine. So I thought that was important, and I took out an ad in the local paper, and got a few responses and a few phone calls, but no one was willing to come on camera, and partly that was because they were told they weren't allowed to. Yep. So, look, it was unfortunate, but all I could do within that was to be able to, tell the story as what I saw it, and I worked very hard to make sure that it was, even though, as it turns out, it was one side of the story, that it was all factually based.
There's no lack of opportunity really for big companies such as Whitehaven to get their story out. So whilst I admire you for attempting to do so, there's plenty of opportunities in the corporate-dominated press. So as an independent filmmaker, where do you sit, I guess, in terms of your philosophy with filmmaking and with alternative media? An important hole you're filling in putting together a documentary like this?
Oh, look, I think no doubt, and that's where, when I went up there and initially was going to make a short documentary, and the more I sort of looked around, I saw and realised that a feature documentary needed to be made, and somebody needed to make that, and I kind of went, well, I was that somebody. I felt that I had the ability to be able to do that, and also that the mindset to take that risk in doing it. It's a big risk, financially and emotionally to engage in such a project, and I think that it is really important. I think that what you've said about mainstream media, everything is in sound bites these days, and I realised that it was a very significant issue in this country, and it was a piece of Australian history in the likes of Jabiluka and Franklin River, and Franklin River never sort of got anything made. Jabiluka did to a certain point, but I think that for an historical film, or to capture it, that in the future that we can look back on, of that it just doesn't become a mythical story.
Kudos to you. I understand there was over 700 hours of footage there. You've over 50 interviews. You've done it all yourself, and you've crowdfunded it. Obviously, in some ways, is a reflection of the Leard campaign itself, in that it's very much come from the grassroots and coming together of lots of energy. As independent broadcasters, support you and encourage our listeners to get along to the viewing in Fremantle.
No worries. So just with that, so I think that the way that we're screening it is through a new initiative called TUG, and there are other platforms that we have to meet a minimum threshold. Yep. In order for the screening to go ahead. And we have about 7 days left to meet that threshold to guarantee that screening. We still have 60 tickets to sell, so I'd really encourage your listeners to spread the word and to sort of go online. There's a number of ways, but probably the easiest for on the radio would just to be going to blackholemovie.com.au and find the link to the screening, and the more that we can reach that threshold, we can guarantee those ticket sales and the screening to happen. So